Well, welcome to episode 414 of 10-Minute Record Reviews. And this time, it's a special episode. It's Jazz Under the Radar, the 5th edition of that series. And once again, in this series, I highlight excellent jazz recordings, probably unknown to most viewers, perhaps hard to find at present, but definitely worth seeking out. And I'll reiterate, too, that these are not necessarily budget titles. I've got another series that deals with those. These are more accurately considered to be records that are off the beaten track, albums by artists or released on labels which may be hard to find or about which there may not be much written. I'm very excited about this particular episode, not least because it's been a while since I was able to shoot a video, but also because these are all wonderful records. That said, as I say, there is an element of obscurity about all these 10 records, and I hope there are some pleasant surprises in here. And if there aren't, if at the end of this video you say, well, Allan, that one wasn't so obscure, well, maybe that just tells you that you know more about jazz than you thought. Anyway, enough preamble. On with the records. And the very first record I'm going to talk about is this record, released by Benny Green, the Benny Green Quintet, actually. It's called Glidin Along. It came out on Jazzland in... when was this? 1961. And Jazzland, of course, was a budget imprint of Riverside Records run by Orrin Keepnews. It's one of those peculiar records where the leader, although he's not unknown by any stretch of the imagination, is probably less well known than his sidemen, because the people on this record include the great bassist Paul Chambers, well known for his work with Miles Davis, Junior Mance on piano, Johnny Griffin on tenor sax, all well-established leaders in their own right by the time this record comes out. Benny Green released a fair number of records. He recorded for Blue Note, amongst others, but because he was essentially a swing-influenced trombonist as opposed to, say, a hard bop specialist, his music was not as fashionable in the late 50s and early 60s as, say, that of J.J. Johnson. So even though this is, I think, his 11th record in the period between 1955 and 1961 as a leader, his name in ensuing decades has kind of been sidelined. He had recorded for Blue Note earlier, as I mentioned, but Alfred Lion, I guess, didn't see much return on that investment because very little was done to reissue his titles once they came out the first time. So here he is in 1961, recording as essentially a B-list artist on Riverside's budget label, but make no mistake, this is an excellent record, and he's surrounded by A-listers. It's a very listenable and diverse program of music, including a very quirky track B1, called, Green's Scene, which is basically a vocal outing, amongst other things, for the whole band. It's not one of the best known Jazzland releases, but it's definitely one worth keeping an eye out for. Now, the next record I want to talk about is this record by Bob Cooper, the music of Bob Cooper. Bob Cooper, of course, was a Stan Kenton alumnus who, other than a burst of recordings in the latter part of the 1950s, essentially existed as a sideman in the recording studio. This is one of a handful of releases that he issued as a leader, and probably one of his best too, along with the record he did with Bud Shank for Pacific called Blowin' Country. This one came out on Contemporary. I've actually got the UK pressing, which I think was put out by Vogue Records. Anyway, the pressing is just as nice, if not nicer, than the original Contemporary. And it has his beautiful wife, June Christie. Sorry, glossiness is making it hard to see. On the front cover, she, of course, was well known as a jazz singer in her own right. She put out that wonderful record, Something Cool, and she also sang for the Kenton Band. Now, the first side of this record is given over entirely to Bob Cooper compositions. It's something called, it's a whole piece actually called Jazz Theme and 4 Variations, and they're all about 4 minutes or more long, so actually quite a lot of music on the first side. The second side is all standards by Charlie Parker, Ellington, Gershwin, etc., etc. That first side is basically a foray into what you might say classic West Coast jazz. It's heavily arranged, it's compositional, it has, pretensions of grandeur in its, the way it's framed as classical music almost. That would all be damning if it didn't swing, but it does swing, and there's no surprise why, because he's joined by Victor Feldman, Lou Levy, by Mel Lewis, by Frank Rosolino, and he's also got the Candoli brothers on trumpet, Don Fagerquist, and so on. So it's really the West Coast Mafia here, high quality players. They're here in force, and the music is just excellent. The standards are all beautifully executed, and because it was produced originally by Contemporary Records, it's engineered by the great Roy Dunan, so the sonic quality of this record is unsurpassed. So check it out, and if you like this one, I highly recommend you check out Blowin' Country as well. As I mentioned, that one's on Pacific, but it also is packed with local West Coast talent. Now, the next record I want to talk about is a great example of a terrible album cover on a no-mark label, which has some of the best music you're likely to hear. And it's this one by Billy Taylor, I Wish I Knew How It Would Feel to Be Free. You can see that somebody has cleverly marked it up with Sharpie all over as well. Now, Billy Taylor was, of course, one of the great early bebop players. He was a house piano player at Birdland between, well, roughly 1945 and 1949-50. That meant he played with almost everybody right at the start of all that. He was a great musician, but he was also a teacher. He was an author. He was an educator. He was a scholar of music. He was a radio and TV host. He was basically what you might call a jazz activist, if such a thing exists. He composed lots and lots of music, and beginning in the 1950s, he recorded plenty as well. He's got something like 50 records as a leader. A lot of those records were made for Prestige or for ABC Paramount, but he also made records for Riverside, Mercury, Argo, Atlantic, Capitol, and others. This one is made well into the 1960s on an obscure label called Tower Records, which has nothing to do with the retail music chain. It's a live record in a trio setting with Ben Tucker and Grady Tate, and to say that it swings is to do it a disservice by lumping it in with other records which kind of swing. This record really swings. And not only is the playing fantastic, they're playing some wonderful tracks. So side one, for instance, they're playing two tracks by Clare Fischer, Pensativa and Morning, which are Clare Fischer's probably greatest two compositions. They sandwich the title track, I Wish I Knew How It Would Feel to Be Free, which was a track which Billy had composed about 5 years earlier. It was a civil rights anthem, and the version on here is electric, and the crowd is into it. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that this is one of the best sides of a piano trio record that you'll ever hear. It'll give you the same endorphins as, say, Vince Guaraldi, but it's much more soulful. And side two is also pretty wicked. TNT is a highlight. There's also a great cover of Bobby Hebb's Sunny. Anyway, super record. Look for it, notwithstanding the cover. Now, the next record I want to talk about is a record by that little-known, niche and unheralded group, Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers. Now, I can hear you saying, Allan, I'm not so sure how obscure those guys are. Are they really under the radar? Well, that's a fair point. However, Blakey and his group, or groups because he was changing the composition frequently, recorded widely, most famously for Blue Note, but for lots and lots and lots of other labels as well, in other countries as well, and there are a lot of live recordings, and it's kind of hard to keep track of all those things. Some of those records that were made overseas only belatedly had a domestic release. Again, they also changed lineups with great frequency, and you can debate long and hard what the best lineup of the Jazz Messengers actually was. The early 50s lineup with Horace Silver and Hank Mobley was obviously fantastic, but another lineup of which I'm particularly fond was the one that existed in the latter part of 1958 with Benny Golson on tenor sax and Lee Morgan on trumpet. That's the lineup which produced the classic Blue Note release and probably Blakey's best-known record, Moanin'. Now, Morgan, of course, would stick around for a number of years. He played well into the early 1960s with Blakey, but Golson would leave pretty soon in early 1959 to set up his Jazztet with Art Farmer. So his tenure with Blakey was brief, measured in months rather than years, but for me it contains some of the best music that the Jazz Messengers ever released. There's something about Golson's playing. It's so musical, it's not showy. I just love it very much. And as a consequence of his short tenure with Blakey, Moanin' is the only U.S. studio release that particular lineup actually recorded. The rest of their recorded output, and there are several records, are all done in Europe. There's a studio recording, there's a soundtrack, and then there are several live recordings. So 3 at Club Saint-Germain, the 3 volumes which are on RCA, and this one on Fontana, which is recorded at the Paris Olympia. It's released in 1959 in France. I have a Japanese press from 1961, which sounds skookum. And as I say, it's a live recording. You've got brilliant playing from both of the horns. You get a very tight, very Art Blakey-ish version of the Golson classic Whisper Not. And it's really interesting to contrast that version with Golson's own version from earlier in 1958. Anyway, it's a great record. It's worth digging into, and I encourage you to look for it. Now, the next record I want to talk about is this one by the Vinnie Burke All-Stars. Okay, now this is genuinely under the radar. You can see I've got a somewhat battered copy, and it's a little more water damaged on the back as well. I won't show you, really out of shame. Creed Taylor was a young man on a mission. in the late 1950s. He made his name in the record business as the upstart young producer who, at least briefly, rescued Bethlehem Records from obscurity. He then made the jump to ABC Paramount, who had deeper pockets, and one of the musicians that he brought with him to ABC was the bass player Vinnie Burke. Burke's real name was actually Vincenzo Bucci, but I guess in the 1950s, people wouldn't take you seriously as a jazz musician if you had an Italian name. Same conclusion that George Wallington came to. Times change. As I mentioned, ABC had deeper pockets, and so this is a record on which Taylor was able to spend more money than he might have done at Bethlehem. And so Vinnie is surrounded by players of the caliber of Jimmy Rainey and Joe Puma on guitar, Al Cohn on tenor sax, Irby Green on trombone, Eddie Costa on piano, and Joe Morello, a pre-Dave Brubeck Joe Morello, on drums. And this is music which I think has really enduring appeal. A number of these musicians had some experience with swing-era bands, and Burke's own compositions, of which there are 3, are relatively timeless, I'd say, in a jazz sense, so it's not really self-consciously a swing record or a hard bop record, just a nice, straight-ahead, swinging jazz record. I would certainly say it's superior to Burke's earlier effort as a leader on Bethlehem, which is called East Coast Jazz, not a record I would consider to be Creed Taylor's finest outing as a producer. This one is a favorite of mine. It's very enjoyable. You probably won't have much competition trying to pick it up, and so do have a look for it. The next record I'd like to talk about is by an artist that I featured some months ago on the channel, a different record of his. It is the Belgian saxophonist Bobby Jaspar. This is his record, Bobby Jaspar and His All-Stars. Like the Art Blakey record, it is a live record made in Paris. It's from 1955, and you'll sometimes see it titled, as it was on French releases, Modern Jazz au Club Saint-Germain, or less frequently, Memories of Dick. It also has several different covers, so don't be fooled. As mentioned, I talked about Jaspar the other day when I talked about his record Tenor and Flute. That was after he had moved to New York, and that was put out in Riverside. This is before. It's made in 1955, and he'd made his name in Paris playing at the Club Saint-Germain, particularly with a piano player, a guy by the name of René Urtrige, who's also on this record. Both Jaspar and Urtrige were keen students of American jazz, obviously, as European jazz players, but as used to happen more before globalization, they were able, playing in Paris in relative isolation, to develop a sound which was distinctly theirs and not obviously a copy of any Americanisms. If you spin this, my guess is you're going to start digging it right away, because track 1 is a really boffo cover of Bag's Groove. The record also features a guitarist called Sacha Distel, who I think was popular across a number of genres of music in France. For the most part, they're playing American jazz hits, recent contemporary American jazz hits, but there is one composition by Jaspar himself called Memory of Dick, which is a tribute to the late piano player from Boston, Dick Twardzik, who had been touring with Chet Baker, I think about a year or so before this record is made. Jaspar had met them, and then Twardzik had died very soon afterwards of a heroin overdose. Anyway, this is a very fine bop record. It's hard to go wrong, I would say, with almost any of Bobby Jaspar's music, and this will give you a sense, I think, of why American jazz critics were so receptive to him when he finally made the move to New York a year later. Now, this next record about which I'm going to talk is part of a category of records I would normally usher people away from, and that is Brazilian music made by people who aren't Brazilians. However, I will make an exception for this record, which is a record put out by Bud Shank, Clare Fischer, and Joe Pass on Pacific called Brasamba. It came out, I think, in 1963. Now, when the bossa nova sound went to the top of the pop charts in the early mid-1960s, every American jazz musician with an eye for a dollar made themselves a bossa nova record. And that usually meant some pretty wooden playing with rhythms very inexpertly borrowed, as the latest Texas tenor had a crack at one-note samba or desafinado. Now, I'm not going to say that this record is entirely free of those tendencies. One of the challenges that happens when American jazz musicians in this era try to play bossa nova is, well, particularly the sound of the drums and the rhythm section in general is just heavier. There's a heavier touch than you would get on a Brazilian record. And there's still a little bit of that, but it's not too bad. And this is still a much better record than many of those in that category for a couple of reasons, one of which is the playing of Bud Shank. Now, there he is on the cover. Bud Shank, of course, played alto sax as well, is, as some of you will know from other videos in his channel, indirectly responsible for bossa nova, because he made a record with Laurindo Almeida in Los Angeles in 1953-ish, which was a very light, airy record, him playing alto sax, Almeida playing guitar, which evoked a lot of the sounds of Almeida's youth in Brazil. Didn't sell that many copies in the States, but it did get taken to Brazil by Almeida and distributed, and it found its way into the hands of people like Antonio Carlos Jobim and João Gilberto and Vinicius de Moraes and all the rest of the people who created in a couple of years, or a few years, the sound of bossa nova. A few years later, their music conquers the world. Shank, of course, ironically, is incredibly ignorant of all this, goes to Brazil on tour in 1963-64, and is shocked to find that everyone has his record and considers him to be basically the OG bossa nova guy. So, the reason why this record works so well is that you really wouldn't have the bossa nova except for the fact that Brazilian musicians were so impressed by the lightness and airiness and the feel of Shank's playing in the first place. So if any American musician has a right to say that their playing is inherently sympathetic to the bossa nova, it is Bud Shank. The other reason to really like this record, and the other reason this record has a wonderful feel, is the musicianship of Joe Pass, who in some people's estimation is the best jazz guitarist who ever lived. I personally am not competent to make those kinds of judgments, but I do know that whenever you hear Joe Pass on this record, he adds rather than subtracts, and he brings the subtlety, which is so important when you're playing bossa nova. But you don't have to judge this record as a bossa nova record, although it makes a pretty credible attempt at that status. You can just judge it as a really good jazz record, and it is a really good jazz record. The next record I'm going to talk about is a lurid green record, although not a real green record, that's cruel, by Shorty Rogers and his Giants, Martians Come Back, and this was released on Atlantic, early on in Atlantic's run as a serious jazz label. I've got this in a plastic cover, which I usually don't do when I'm showing records on videos, but all four seams are split on this one, which is why. Now, of all the white American jazz musicians who achieved significant success in Los Angeles in the 1950s and part of that great West Coast jazz scene, almost all of them were veterans of big bands, particularly Stan Kenton's big band, Woody Herman's big band, Claude Thornhill's big band, and so on. Most of them, as the 1950s wore on, took the opportunity to work in smaller groups, sextets, quintets, quartets, trios, and so on. A good example was that Bob Cooper record I showed you earlier. One of the exceptions to that rule is the work of Shorty Rogers, who typically preferred to play in groups of 9, 10, 11 musicians. Whenever he was recording in this era, he typically referred to these larger groups as his Giants, although they didn't tour as a set group per se. It was really just a constellation of people he knew who would gather in the studio. The result is what you would expect. It's kind of a hybrid of small group music and bigger band music. And while I don't think that Rogers is as good as Marty Paich in finding intimacy in a larger group of musicians, he gets pretty close to what Paich is able to achieve. This is a really pleasing record with some great soloing. It's essentially a West Coast all-star group behind him. He's got about 8 or 9 musicians on each track. For the most part, it's melodic, it's spacious. There are a few denser passages reminiscent of bigger orchestras, but I absolutely encourage you to give this record a chance because Rogers is an excellent arranger and his talents are well on display here. So, Martians Come Back. Now, the next record I'm going to talk about is one which features jazz violin, and if you are a fan of jazz violin, as I am, then it's quite possible that Stefan Grappelli was your entry point to the role of the violin as an improvisational instrument. I spent hours and hours and hours and hours as an undergraduate listening to this one record I had, which was a joint live recording of David Grisman and his band along with Stefan Grappelli. That was one of my entry points into jazz, and if you haven't heard it, I encourage you to seek it out. This is a jazz violin record, but it's not by Stefan Grappelli. It's a joint venture by John Lewis of the Modern Jazz Quartet and the Danish jazz violinist Svend Asmussen. Now, Svend Asmussen is kind of a remarkable guy. He lived to be nearly 101. I think he just died a few years ago. He was an actor as well as a musician. He was on TV, radio, films, on the stage, and as a musician, he had a career which spanned some 70 plus years. He was born early enough to have been influenced directly at the time by the famous Hot Club de France, featuring Django Reinhardt and Stefan Grappelli. After the war, he was very active on the European jazz scene. He also played frequently with touring American musicians, and he had extended periods of collaboration with Kenny Drew and Ed Thigpen. This record is more of a one-off combination, this time with John Lewis of the Modern Jazz Quartet, there's John, who along with Milt Jackson was essentially the creative force behind the MJQ. And they're joined by the Ellington alumnus, Jimmy Wood, on bass, and by Stura Kalin on drums. And he was a guy who played quite frequently with American musicians, actually. He's also on a record, or at least I think it's a radio broadcast, which eventually became a record, with Eric Dolphy from a year or so before. This is a great record. It's very different from a Stefan Grappelli jazz violin record. Grappelli, of course, was principally a swing era musician. Lewis's music, and Lewis is the primary driving force here compositionally, all but one of the tracks are by him, is often, bridging the gap between bop and classical, so-called third stream and so on. And Asmussen is a great foil for that. There are great versions on here of Lonely Woman and Django, so keep your eye out. The final record I want to talk about is this record with a cheesy cover called The Poll Winners. Now, once upon a time, Downbeat used to poll its readership and jazz critics and come up with answers as to who the most popular and well-regarded musicians in every particular instrument were on an annual basis. Now, they still do this, but back in the 1950s and early 1960s, when jazz was still top of the heap in terms of adult musical taste anyway, it was a much bigger deal. Now, record labels, of course, began to use this as a marketing ploy, and that tendency reached its apogee with Contemporary Records, who asked these three players, Ray Brown, Barney Kessel, and Shelly to make this record. All three of them had won their respective polls not only in Downbeat, but also in Metronome and Playboy. Yes, people do read it for the articles, both in 1956 and in 1957. Both Kessel and Manne had been recording records for Contemporary for a number of years. Each of them had several records out as a leader. Brown was perhaps best known as Oscar Peterson's bassist, but he'd also made records of his own as a leader for Verve. This record spurs the creation of a supergroup, and it's the first of 4 records these guys would put out between 1957 and 1960. There's also a reunion record which comes out in 1976. It is, as you can imagine, a guitar trio record, but everybody gets a chance to shine. It's largely standards except for one Kessel number. All of these, of course, are executed brilliantly. I've got the first 4 of these records, which, with one exception, all have absolutely dismal cover art, all kind of making a pun on the word pole, which kind of makes you wonder why they didn't cover Memory of Dick. Anyway, while you can quibble as to whether all those records reach the heights of this one, they're all good, and the reunion record is pretty good too, although it also has terrible cover art. In any event, snap this one up, or any of them you can find. So, that's it for this 5th edition of Jazz Under the Radar. I hope that these inspire you to go digging. I hope that maybe these turn you on to some other records by some of these artists as well. I look forward to your comments. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.